Our speaker today is Dr. Ingrid Clayton. Ingrid is a clinical psychologist, and I'm just going into my, excuse me, while I go into my notes, we'll edit all this. And I'm going to read you a little from Ingrid's website that explains a lot about what she's going to talk about today, and which is her new book, Believing Me, Healing from Narcissistic Abuse and Complex Trauma. And this is by Ingrid, her own words, beautifully written. What if emotional abuse is so hidden, its effects remain unchallenged for decades, masquerading as personal failings? Believing Me is an emotionally gripping memoir that gives language to the hidden and ineffable nature of childhood trauma and how it can imprint on a person, resulting in fractured self-esteem, addictions, perfectionism, and a string of abusive relationships. So, by reclaiming her story, Ingrid transcended the role of healer into someone becoming healed, showing us what real healing looks like in the process. So with that, Ingrid, thank you so much for coming. This is your, by the way, Ingrid's second workshop with us. Thank you so much, Ingrid. I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick, so much for having me, for asking me back. I am so grateful to be here. I love that there's a lot of 12-step folks here, but that it's an open workshop. And for that reason, and I sort of did this the last time that we met, I haven't planned a more sort of formal workshop. I'm approaching this more that as I would a 12-step meeting, where I love the set aside prayer. I love that was read. And I'm just inviting my higher power to speak through me in the context of this group, which I think is a special group. And like I said, I'm grateful to be here. So I'll start at the beginning. My name is Ingrid. I am an alcoholic. I'm also a clinical psychologist, a trauma therapist, and a trauma survivor. I'm going to change my view here if I can. Let's give that a try. Okay. And yes, so I celebrated 27 years sober in September. I got sober fairly young. I was 21, just a couple of weeks a legal drinker. And I grew up in what I knew to be an alcoholic home. It was in 8th grade when we had our first research paper that I could have written on anything, and my friends certainly were. They were writing about their interests and their hobbies. And the title of my research paper when I was 12 years old was Alcoholism, the Family Disease, because I have spent a lifetime trying to solve them, trying to solve me, and in a lot of ways ended up spinning my wheels and feeling like I was on this giant kind of whack-a-mole game, like looking at symptoms and kind of maybe getting some symptom relief, but it felt like the larger thing underneath wasn't ever really being attended to. And so then I would find the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. And what that looked like was, after I got sober, when I was 21, I was pursuing music as a singer-songwriter. And eventually, like a lot of us do in recovery, I decided to go back to school because I left school while I was still using. I couldn't show up for classes. I wasn't there for the right intentions. So I left. So I went back in sobriety with the right intentions to be a student, to learn how to study, and finally got my undergraduate degree. And along the way, I was really attracted to psychology and ended up getting my master's and then my PhD in clinical psychology. So I had that sort of formal training. I was still very committed to my 12-step recovery. I feel like in a lot of ways, I grew up in AA. When I first came to meetings, I called my family. I lived in Colorado and I had moved to New York. I was, wanting to be a rock star at the time. And I knew that I couldn't stop drinking. And when I knew that I couldn't stop drinking, I did what a girlfriend had done, which was call her family to ask for help. And I called my family to ask for help. And my stepdad said, you just need to learn how to become a functional alcoholic like the rest of us, And I was like, okay, that was not helpful. Let me go to the phone book. And I went to the phone book and I found the number for central office. And the guy on the phone was like, there's a meeting like tonight. It's a meeting full of young people. It's right around the corner. And I was like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Like, first of all, I'm not a young person. Even though I was 21, I really, truly felt like I was having a midlife crisis. And I didn't want to go that night. But he made it sound like, no, this is the meeting you have to go to. And bless him, right? Because he knows that when you're willing enough to call, you might be willing enough to actually go to a meeting and cross that threshold when we were in person, and show up. And so I did, and I had no intentions of speaking. To this day, I remember the feeling in my body of just utter shame. I didn't know that it was shame, but it was utter shame. I felt like every nerve ending was exposed. You could see how bad I was, how evil I was. If you really knew me, you wouldn't want me there. And I went anyway, and I sat down at this meeting in New York City. And they said, are there, any new people here? And I thought the guy leading the meeting was a counselor of some sort. I didn't know he was a member. And this girl next to me raised her hand and said, hi, it's my first meeting. And I was like, oh man, it was as though because she did it, I felt like I had to do it. And so I raised my hand and I was like, my name is Ingrid and I think I might be an alcoholic. And someone said in that meeting, people who aren't alcoholics don't usually find themselves walking into AA wondering if they are. And I was like, oh, okay, fair point. And, but because I'd raised my hand, and said my name, people came up to me afterwards and they were like, hi, Ingrid, nice to meet you. How are you? My name is so-and-so. Please come back. And it was so overwhelming. I could not have just a normal conversation, but I felt hope. I felt enough hope that I was like, okay, I think there's something here for me. I think I need to keep coming back, but I cannot come back to this meeting because now they know my name and they're going to come and put their, hand in my face and I cannot talk to them. So I went to a different meeting every single day for 90 days. Manhattan, the Bronx, just like covered the territory because I had to go and do my day count. Say I had 13 days, 14 days, 15 days. It felt so important to me. But then I had to run out of there before anybody tried to say hello. Until my 89th day, actually, I found a meeting and I had like enough, 3 months of recovery that I felt like I could go back. And when I went back to that morning meeting, 3 subway rides away because options were getting thin. I went back every day for the rest of that first year. And those people became my new notion of family, right? This home group, this idea that we were a small little intimate group, but it felt so diverse, young and old and black and white, Wall Street tycoons and the guys that were walking over from the VA hospital where they were staying. And it was amazing. And they supported me. They saw me, start to write music, what I wanted to do, and get on stage, which is what I wanted to do. And they were all lined up in the front row. And it was amazing, right? So I grew up in that way in AA. I learned how to be honest. I was a compulsive liar. I lied about stupid things. It wasn't things of importance. It was like, I lied about what I had for lunch. I lied about, oh, yes, I know oh, yeah. Do you know about this thing? Oh, yes, I know about that movie. I just was terrified that, again, if you knew me, if you really knew me, if I said the actual answer, it would render me like not friendly or appropriate to talk to or whatever. I was just so full of shame is what it was. So sober at 21, really stayed committed. I got the sponsor and I worked the steps and I worked the steps again and I became a sponsor and I took people through the steps. After I went through my master's program, I started working inpatient treatment centers here in Los Angeles, where I'm from, or where I live now. So I was very, very steeped in recovery and going to personal therapy all the while, right? Ever since I sought out a counselor in high school, I've been sort of doing the work. I've been a seeker. I've been hungry to fix and change this thing that in a lot of ways I did identify as the ism, as we talk about. And a lot of the recovery stuff in 12-step framework was very helpful. I got a lot of relief. I've never taken a drink since that first day that I walked in AA. I'm so grateful for that. And for me, there was something that has always been missing. And, I went on the yoga retreats and the meditation retreats, and I got to get down on my knees to pray. Maybe that's the thing. And always trying to kind of be this good girl, very compliant, like, what's the answer? I'm going to do it. But still feeling this deep shame and this brokenness. It felt just like this fundamental brokenness. And as I'm working so hard on myself, I'm, feeling kind of anxious all the time and like a fraud, and all this self-doubt and all these relationships, constant, largely romantic relationships that were so unhealthy and dysfunctional. It was like the same bad relationship with a different face over and over and over. And all I really wanted was like a family of my own, and to be married, and to be a mom, and to have a successful life in that way. And it just felt like it was not possible. Somewhere along the way, when I was in finishing up my PhD, I did my dissertation research on spiritual bypass in Alcoholics Anonymous. So that was my research project. And for those that don't know, spiritual bypass is a defense mechanism where you use your spiritual practice or ideas to avoid your feelings. And so really it's this idea that I was engaging in, which is, if I pray hard enough to the right higher power, if I meditate long enough, if I do the right spiritual tool, I will transcend the human condition. And when I learned about this concept in school, it was just like this slow motion arrow, just like, psh, oh, I know what they're talking about. And I felt like I not only experienced it, but I saw it a lot in 12-step, because, you take people that are tending towards wanting to get out of themselves in these different ways, and then you put them in a spiritual program. What are the chances that we're going to use the spiritual program to avoid ourselves in the same way that we might have used these other things? So that was one attempt. I can see it going, okay, what's the missing piece? Like, maybe this is it. Maybe understanding these defense mechanisms related to spirituality, and how sometimes they're harmful and sometimes they might even be helpful. Maybe that was the thing. And it was certainly interesting and helpful, but again, it didn't really solve what felt like this underlying problem that I had. Sorry, one second. And so maybe it's more 12-step programs, right? And there's this saying that many of you have probably heard: you're not really sober until you're in at least 3 12-step programs. And I was like, look at me doing all the things. Like, I'm in AA, and I'm in Al-Anon, and now I'm in DA, and I did a tour in OA. And it was just like, okay, where's the thing? And again, I will say, in every single program, AA got me sober. Really did save my life in that way. No question. Gave me amazing tools, taught me how to be honest, taught me how to show up, to sit in the front row, put my hand up, be visible. My community is still, my roots are there. My community is there. Al-Anon, when I eventually married an active alcoholic, not knowing that he was an active alcoholic, but eventually found the bottles hidden in our closet. He wasn't contributing to our marriage. He wasn't working. He didn't think he had a problem. And I'm doing the thing I always did as a child with my alcoholic family, which is like, aren't I good enough? Aren't you gonna like choose me over alcohol? And it seemed like, once again, the answer was, No, so I'm going to Al-Anon, and there's this one meeting I was going to every week where I would just sob my eyes out. And these people did that thing that we do in these rooms, which is love you until you can love yourself. And I finally loved myself enough to realize that I had to leave that marriage. And it was at the time, it was the hardest thing I had ever done. Because I felt like it was a signal to all this underlying stuff that was like, oh, I really am that broken. I really am that damaged. I am an addiction therapist who married an active alcoholic and didn't know it. Like, what must be wrong with me that this is my life experience? And at the time, I'd never hung a shingle saying I was working in codependency, but my clients were my whole practice was populated with women who were married to active alcoholics. And all day long, I'm talking to them about like self-esteem and, setting healthy boundaries. And meanwhile, I'm going home to a man who always drank more than I was comfortable with, not knowing he was hiding all these bottles of booze. So it was so painful to have those veils kind of lifted on the truth of who I was and what my actual experiences were. And no matter how much I tried to dress up this relationship, because I did, I'll fix it. I'll make it pretty. I can sort of make it presentable. I can make excuses for him, all that kind of classic codependent stuff that I didn't really know was classic codependent stuff. I had to face all of that. I had to face that in a lot of ways, I was living in this giant fantasy, hoping that it would one day come true. And meanwhile, my reality is like, that is not the relationship that you're in. And my marriage, like I said, was sort of mirroring the relationships that came before it and some relationships that came after. So I felt like I was just in this chronic pattern that no matter how much therapy and how many couches I sat on and how many retreats I went to and how many 12-step programs I was in and being asked to speak and, like I said, sponsor and doing service and doing all the things, but feeling like that life that I really wanted was not attainable. It just felt really far away. And like a part of my work was that I had to grieve the loss of what I always wanted and go, okay, well, I guess this is what my higher power has in store for me, and kind of, it felt like I just had to lower the bar on what was possible and available to me and accept life on life's terms. And let me think. I did eventually, after doing more work on relationships and looking at what are my patterns here? How do I keep ending up in the same relationship? I did some work around that and ended up meeting a man and going, gosh, he's so lovely. And we have this great conversation and I feel at ease and he's funny and he's smart and he's all these things. But I didn't have what I thought was chemistry, just general chemistry. So I thought, oh, maybe we're just meant to be friends, right? I did not understand that chemistry from a perspective of trauma and through the lens of childhood trauma was what was familiar. The chaos in my childhood informed my chemistry, right? So here's where I start to get some answers and kind of go outside of what I'd always known in terms of recovery and health and healing, is that I really thought that if I did all the right things, and acted as if and read all the books, and like I said, showed up in this very conscious, what I now know, prefrontal cortex, rational mind kind of a way, that it would fix all of the things that I was feeling and experiencing from a body-based nervous system perspective. And it didn't work. It didn't work, I now know, because trauma is stored in this subconscious nervous system, body-based way that my conscious mind, it's like the two almost don't the body's not interested in my opinions. The body's not interested in what I think I know about a thing. The body is interested in survival. We're very primitive in that way. We will always privilege safety and survival over everything else. And my body was wired in this chaotic, alcoholic, dysfunctional, neglectful family system where I had to learn how to survive in that environment. And that wiring then became my imprinting, became my coping skills. It was all that I knew. I wanted something different. I knew that other people had something different, but my desire for it and thinking my way through never changed the only thing that I knew in my body. And so I'm sitting across from this man that I have met, and I'm like, wow, he's like so lovely. And I'm not understanding the difference between that crazy, familiar chemistry and compatibility. We couldn't have been any more compatible. And my body was like, we could be friends. And thank goodness I kind of hung in there long enough, and I saw him again, and I wanted to see him again. And it felt so different. And I had mentors and, even a sponsor that said to me, Ingrid, you always were trying to make the wrong person right. And now you're trying to make the right person wrong. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. And I believed him. And now, fast forward, we've been together almost 10 years. It's the healthiest, most loving relationship of my life. Different from just about every relationship that came before. I have never felt manipulated, discarded, disrespected. He's never lied to me. And these were things that growing up in that environment, I kind of thought that these were things you had to compromise on. It was like people say, no relationship is perfect and you got to meet someone halfway and all of these things. And I took those sayings and applied them to what I had to compromise on and cope with in my childhood. And suddenly, what am I doing? I'm dating all of these actively addicted, lying, manipulative, dysfunctional people. And I lost my train of thought there. But anyway, I am now in this relationship that has given me this new relationship to safety that I've never really had before, quite frankly. I feel like he really sees me. He really knows me. He's not judging me. He's, like I said, he's not manipulating me, not trying to use me to fix something in him. And so we were together about 5 years when my stepfather passed away. And when my stepdad died, when I got the news, I literally laid down on the floor. I was alone in my house. I'm just feeling the impact of it even now. I felt safer in the world than I had ever felt before. And I just put my hand on my heart. It was like this sort of grace was washing over me, and it was a visceral experience. And my conscious thought is like, this isn't what you're supposed to feel when someone dies. Like, geez, how selfish. Like, I was grateful that he was gone. Even though we didn't have that much contact over the years, he was still married to my mother until the day he died. So he was always in my orbit. And therefore, he was always influencing me in this way that was really brutal. Because what I came to understand is that my stepdad is a classic narcissist, someone who has narcissistic personality disorder. And so all of that, what I just had previously kind of related to active alcoholism, I've come to understand that, yes, it was that. And it was a host of other things that we see with narcissism, including gaslighting. So gaslighting is intentionally manipulating someone so that they literally question not only what happened, but their entire reality, their relationship to themselves. he isolated us, moved us out into the middle of nowhere in the mountains and kept us all really kind of separate. He pitted our siblings against one another. And there was a real grooming of me as a young girl, where I now know he had a pattern of grooming young girls to be their girlfriend or wife. And, my mom was his third marriage at this point. And he was doing it with me, what he had done with women before my mom. And I kind of knew it, but it wasn't so overt that I didn't ever really know. And so part of what I'm learning from feedback related to my story as it relates to childhood trauma in general is that there is this did it really happen? Was it that bad? And in part that happens because when you're a child, and again, we go back to this lens and language of trauma and the nervous system and safety, we are developmentally hardwired for relationship, right? We're not someone who comes into the world when we're born and we can function on our own. We literally need our caregivers to feed us and bathe us and clothe us. And so we are wired for relationship. So we come into the world with this, I need you because my survival depends on you. So what often happens with childhood trauma is when we are not taken care of or seen or attended to, in all the ways that can happen, the child has to privilege the relationship above all else because they don't exist if the relationship doesn't exist. So they internalize it must be me. I can't make my caregiver bad because I need them to survive, right? So I had part of that going on just developmentally, I have to solve this problem in me. It must be me. It can't really be them. And then I had all of this gaslighting that wasn't only being directed at me, but in the case of my stepdad with my mom, he convinced my mom that I was the liar. I was the manipulator. Often what narcissists do is they take all of these things that they're doing and they project it onto the victim. And they're the ones that are all bad, right? And so he convinced partially me of those things, and he 100% convinced my mom of those things, so that when I did finally have a voice and say, there is stuff going on here that is really bad, and school counselors were saying it's really bad, and social services was brought in, my mom said, ooh, I believe that you believe that that's happening, Ingrid, but I don't believe that it is. And there's a lot more there that I obviously go into in the book, but I kind of want to fast forward to what does all of this have to do with this marriage of trauma, childhood trauma, complex trauma. Complex trauma is relational trauma, and what that has to do with recovery, generally speaking. Because my stepdad died, and I was struck with all these stories that I had to write. It was to this day, I kind of can't believe what happened and how it happened. But I'd be woken up in the middle of the night, night after night, with these scenes and stories, not just from my childhood, but all of those dysfunctional relationships and all of the ways that I had tried to cope that didn't quite get me there. It was these individual essays, and I didn't know how they related or hung together or why they were coming. I thought, am I meant to be sharing about what it means to be a flawed therapist? In other words, a human being therapist. And it wasn't until several years later that I saw what I was writing, because I could finally see my own story from a trauma therapist's eyes. And I went, oh my word, I have complex PTSD. That's what this thing is that I've been trying to solve in all of these ways. And it has ultimately never been solved, because all of the things that I was doing were not trauma-informed or trauma-specific therapies or tools. Trauma lives in the body and the nervous system in this different way than I was cognitively trying to approach my issues. I have complex PTSD, and it's a result of narcissistic abuse. It's not just the alcoholism. It's that deep emotional, psychological abuse. I was given the silent treatment for weeks, months on end. I didn't exist in my own home. It was like I was dead to the people that were meant to take care of me. And then go out into the world, into your day, go show up for school like nothing is going on. The unpredictability of the addiction, the walking on eggshells, the outbursts, the grooming, the way that my stepdad confessed that he was in love with me, and the way that he tried to make me love him back, and all of these things. I had talked about some of this stuff in therapy, but it was from this very cognitive talk therapy kind of a place. I had written about all of this stuff in my inventories, but what I now know is that when it whittles down to my part, there's something that went missing in that for me. I think it was helpful to look at it from my side of the street and to show up. But on the other hand, I can see that part of my trauma response growing up in that environment, so maybe you have all heard of the 4 F's: fight, flight, freeze, and what we now know is the fawning trauma response. The fawning trauma response is a very common response in childhood. It's sort of the most primitive of the 4. And it is basically the heartbeat of codependency. It is that I will abandon myself and what I need and what I think to try to take care of you because I need you to survive. And I was stuck. So what can often happen with trauma responses is you learn, it's not a conscious thing, right? These are instincts. It's just the way that the body reacts in order to try to keep you a little bit more safe and maintain whatever connection is there, even if the connection is so dysfunctional. And it was a big go-to for me in childhood. So like I said before, I had this imprinting, this way that I learned to cope, which was largely through the fawning trauma response. And then I carried that unhealed, not knowing it was a trauma response, thinking in some way it's just my personality. Quite frankly, one of the reasons that I ended up probably becoming a therapist was in part a trauma response. I get to show up for you. Your needs are more important than mine. I don't really exist in this relationship. I only matter as I can be of service, right? That it's this thing that I was doing in every relationship. And sorry, all the people entering the waiting room, I'm seeing all the little ding, ding, ding. So here I am engaging in this chronic fawning trauma response, which already tells me I have to fix it. I can't be in a safe relationship. Relationships are not safe. I need to hold the entire burden for this thing in order to cobble together any kind of a relationship at all. And then when I acknowledge some real resentments that I have, and all roads lead back to my part, in some ways, the steps enabled me to stay stuck in this chronic fawning response with these 2 ideas. One is that resentments are the number 1 killer, and anger is the luxury, all of that language, coupled with really always coming down to sort of my part of things. The reason it became problematic is that we can look at the fawning trauma response on a spectrum, and it lies on the other end of the fight trauma response. So the fight trauma response in its healthiest aspect is I can engage in conflict. I can have a voice, right? I can be a person in the room. That's like the healthy expression of the fight response. It can obviously lean more towards violence and bullying and things that are not so healthy. But on the end of the spectrum, so there's fawning. I only exist if you see me. I'm going to do everything. I'm going to abandon myself. people pleasing, all of those tendencies, codependency, and the fight trauma response. In order to heal from an overactive fawning trauma response, I have to move more towards the middle where I have more flexibility. And what that means is leaning towards a fight trauma response. So guess what a lot of people need who are stuck in fawning? They need to know that it's okay to be resentful. They need to know that anger is a healthy, natural, human emotion. What we do with it, do we need to be mindful of that? Absolutely. But to have a fight response at all is a very life-giving, affirming, healthy experience to have. And for a lot of people who grew up with childhood trauma, that fight response was snuffed out. My fight response, when I turned to the counselors and social services and to my mom, and I said, hey, this is a problem and I need help. And they turned to me and they said, you're a liar. You're the problem. Get with the program. You're selfish. Knock it off. Suck it up. Do what you got to do. And then stop spreading these lies. That's what happened to my fight response. So even though consciously in my mind, I knew this is horrific. What is wrong with these people? What my body learned is you will never have a voice again. It's not safe. It makes it worse because it did make it worse. So here I am with all of these very, as I see them, appropriate resentments that I'm carrying around, that I'm recreating, because that's what we do with trauma. We engage in this reenactment. So now all of these relationships are mirroring the ones that I grew up with. I don't understand it as trauma reenactment. And the biggest thing that I have to try to work through this stuff is a framework that is telling me that first column is really the bad guy. And you got to kind of work your way through it and look where you're being selfish, dishonest, self-seeking. And the fawner in me can always point to, oh, I can see. Yeah, I am being selfish because I have more resources than my family does. You know, if I look at it from a disease model, they're still active. They're active in their addiction. They're sicker than I am. So I need to privilege their wounds. I need to be a good daughter. I need to do. And it sounds kind of good. It sounds like kind of altruistic. It sounds, not a lot of people took issue with that, but my body did. Because what I was telling myself every single time I figured out how to swallow the hurt was, you don't really matter. You don't really deserve to be safe. You don't really deserve to have the freedom from those relationships and from that conditioning. And you have to stay tethered to it. And as I stayed tethered, I continued to reenact these patterns of my trauma. I continued to feel full of shame, like I was broken, right? So when we look at complex trauma, it really equates to a distorted sense of self. And in some ways, not consciously, and certainly everyone who's tried to help has come from a place I know of wanting to be truly helpful. But when it wasn't coming from a trauma-informed perspective, it missed me big time. And what time is it? This feels important. It feels important, just as important to me as doing my dissertation on spiritual bypass and going, I know a lot of people are wanting a genuine relationship to higher power. They're not wanting to engage in another defense mechanism. And yet we kind of come by it honestly, right? It's like I said, I'm someone who's kind of wired to want to get outside of myself. And I did it through all the cocktails and the mixing of all of the substances and things. And now I'm not doing that, but I'm still going to have a tendency to want to do it. And so I'm going to do it with the tools that are at my disposal, which was spirituality. I wanted to bring that information back to 12 steps because 12 steps saved my life. It was like, these are my people. This is my community. All these years later, the trauma perspective feels so important to me because listen, I know on our shingle, it doesn't say, come to AA where we're going to solve your trauma. It's not designed to solve complex trauma. But I would wonder about the research that says especially if we look at addiction as an aspect of the flight trauma response. So the flight trauma response is sometimes about running, right? Get out of there. But sometimes flight is about staying in perpetual motion. Sometimes flight is about these obsessive compulsive tendencies. So addiction falls into the flight response. So if I even look at addiction from the lens of trauma, I go, well, yeah, it's a trauma response. The likelihood that there's some underlying trauma that could be addressed differently as an outside issue is probably pretty high. And yet it's really easy to look at some of these things that we're experiencing and just go, oh, my hypervigilance, which is an aspect of complex PTSD, always feeling like the other shoe is going to drop, like I'm not safe, like I have to guard against that all the time because I had to guard against that in my childhood. That can be looked at, oh, that's the committee in your head. Everything can kind of have an answer in a way that makes me go, oh, right. Okay. Yeah. You identify with that too. It must just be my ism. It must just be my addiction. Or like I said, if it's manifesting in a different way, like now it's through food or now it's through money or through these other things. Okay, well, I better just go find another program. And again, those programs were so helpful. I started my business as a private practice clinician in Business Owners Debtors Anonymous. How many classes did my graduate school offer on what it means to run a business and how you do that? The answer is 0, which makes no sense to me because most of us went on to become private practice clinicians. And so I learned how to run a business in BDA. I learned how to do it with higher power being at the top of that, equation of sort of saying, how do I put higher power first and how do I prioritize and take care of myself, but do it in a very conscious way? I learned it all there. And so I'm so grateful for that. My experience is one of a yes and. Yes, so much value. That's my community. So grateful. And my trauma was really missed. And it really kept me stuck and living in survival mode, not knowing it until I was struck with this need. And that to me is higher power, because I didn't sit down and go, I'm going to write a memoir. I'm going to write a memoir on childhood trauma. Like, doesn't that sound fun? I had no interest. This was not on the horizon. This thing came for me. It chose me to be the voice of my story and then to go, wait a second. And how do I make sense of all of this stuff? And the book finally came out in 3 parts. There's the what happened, right? Kind of like what we do here, the what happened, but in this sense, it's the traumatic events. Then there's my trauma responses, all of the ways I lived in unhealed trauma responses and tried to fix them, and it didn't work. And then part 3 is eventually, oh, this is what this is, and this is what I actually have to do to take care of myself. To find some real freedom. And in a lot of ways, that has been having a voice like I'm having here today, right? Moving from the fawning response of like, no, it's all good. And I don't want to ruffle any feathers. And, to going, oh, I'm going to actually move towards the fight response, which is that I belong. I get to have a voice. I'm going to speak the truth. I'm going to speak the truth about my family, even though it's going to upset some people. Because I came to a place where I realized when I'm only privileging their potential hurt, I am hurting me. I stayed small. I stayed stuck. And it almost felt like I had come to where I had to make a choice. I'm either going to privilege their wounding or I have to privilege my healing. And at some point, it was no longer a choice. I had too much information and had come too far. And I felt like I have to save my own life. All of the fawning and all of the codependency and all of the privileging what they needed and how they're stuck and their isms never helped any of them. It never helped anyone. It never brought them to the place that I thought it might, where one day they were going to go, we want to get sober. We want to go to therapy. Oh my gosh, Ingrid, I can't believe we made it all your fault. And we called you the scapegoat and we told you were a liar. I'm so sorry. It never happened. But as long as I held that out as some kind of a fantasy finish line, I stayed way back here, dependent on this thing that was never going to happen. It was particularly never going to happen with narcissistic abuse because, first of all, my stepfather died. But second of all, he absolutely went to his grave with the story intact. And that tends to be the case, that there's never going to be any repair there. And I think a lot of us go, well, I'm a seeker, where I'm wanting to change, I'm wanting to grow and develop, and we project our goodness and our desire to grow onto other people, imagining that if they just had enough information, they're going to want to grow and change too. And it keeps us stuck. It keeps us small. For me, it kept me in really abusive relationships, abusive with other people and abusive to myself, because now I'm self-gaslighting. Now I'm telling myself, you don't really matter. And it doesn't really, all of the stuff that I detested and warped me growing up now lives inside of me, and I'm repeating it. And so, gosh, I know I started saying, let's just see what happens. I feel like I covered a lot of ground and hopefully not too tangential of a way. I know when I spoke here last time, the Q&A was probably like the richest part of my experience. And so I'm kind of wanting to open it up for that. If you don't know already, maybe Patrick already sent it out. I talk a lot about all of these things on Instagram at Ingrid Clayton PhD. And there's an awesome community there, I think, of trauma survivors, clinicians, people that are just doing the work and blowing my mind every day. I have a new YouTube channel where I'm doing some longer form stuff because the Instagram stuff is like shorter form stuff. So you can find me there, same thing, at Ingrid Clayton PhD. The book is called Believing Me. It is a memoir. It is my story, but it's all of the layers of my story in one place. And then because I'm a clinician, I couldn't help but put a glossary in the back. So it's all my story. And then at the end, I'm talking about, well, what is trauma bonding and how does that relate to me? What is trauma reenactment? And so I give a definition, but it ties into my story, because what I learned here too in 12-step is that we can change by sharing our experience, right? I had all this language, narcissism, trauma. I didn't know or understand how it applied to me because I had the blinders on. So I'm sharing my story in the hope that if it resonates at all, people will get access to the right tool for the job. So I don't know where Patrick is or who I turn it over to. I see some hands. I'm not going to be managing that piece, but I'll turn it over to the person who is.